Hey everyone! Tonight we begin with what it was like to be a prostitute in ancient Rome. So turn the lights off and get settled in for a trip back to Roman times. Please give the video a like and subscribe if you enjoy this video. Tell me what you think about the video in the comment section. In the heart of ancient Rome, where marble columns met muddy alleys, where senators debated justice while beggars clutched scraps in the gutter, a shadow economy thrived in silence. Beneath the grandeur of empire, there lived a world rarely mentioned in polished histories, a world where survival often meant selling not labour, but the body itself. Rome was a city of contradictions. By daylight, its forums bustled with commerce and debate. By nightfall, its streets transformed into a different kind of marketplace. Prostitutes moved among taverns, bathhouses and temples, weaving through crowds of merchants, soldiers and travellers. Some were barely visible, faces cloaked, bodies hidden in shadows. Others were brazen, calling out to passers-by with laughter that masked exhaustion. The Roman world did not hide prostitution. It regulated it, taxed it, tolerated it. But it did not respect it. Sex workers were essential and disposable, seen and unseen. Many were slaves with no choice, sold into brothels or owned by pimps. Others were freed women, too poor to survive any other way. Some even came from respectable families, having fallen into disgrace or debt. The city's brothels, lupanars, stood close to public spaces. One of the most infamous, preserved in Pompeii, was hidden just behind the main streets. Its stone beds and faded frescoes still whisper stories of the women who worked there. For many, this was the only home they knew. Small rooms with no windows, a name scratched into the wall, a price negotiated in haste. Not all prostitution took place indoors. The lupae, literally she-wolves, worked the streets, parks and dark corners of Rome. They leaned against walls near the Circus Maximus, waited beneath archways near the baths of Caracalla, or roamed the Subura district, where the poor lived shoulder to shoulder. Their cries echoed in alleys, bargains, laughter, insults, sometimes screams. To be a prostitute in Rome was to be a paradox. You were both legal and disgraced, protected by law and yet excluded from honour. Prostitutes could not marry freeborn men, nor testify in court with credibility. If you were a slave, your owner could rent you out without consent. If you were free, you still bore the mark of infamy that clung for life. But still, they lived. Amid the humiliation and hardship, many found ways to survive, to form friendships, to laugh between customers. Some learned to read, some kept hidden coin stashes, some told stories by candlelight, their voices hoarse from the day, recounting absurd clients or cruel pimps. Rome did not pity them, but they knew how to endure. The city smelled of wine and rot. It echoed with iron sandals, clanging tavern doors, and the dull chant of street performers. In this world, the prostitute was a fixture, familiar yet invisible. To some, she was temptation. To others, shame. To herself, she was simply surviving another Roman day. And so the story begins here, in the dirty corners of empire, where survival is a quiet kind of rebellion. Before we can understand the daily life of Rome's sex workers, we must walk their streets, listen to their city, and hear the rhythm of their footsteps echo through forgotten stone. This is not a tale of emperors or wars, not the history of marble triumphs or golden eagles. It is the story of those Rome used and discarded, those who worked in silence beneath banners and beneath men. Their voices are faint now, but they are still there, if you know where to listen. In the Roman world, prostitution was not a profession one typically chose. It was a fate that arrived like a storm, sudden, brutal and unavoidable. Most women in the trade were there because life had stripped away every other path. Some were born into slavery, destined from birth to serve at the whim of others. Others began life as free citizens, but found themselves trapped by debt, betrayal, or disaster. The largest group came from the ranks of Rome's enslaved. Captives from conquered lands, Gaul, Greece, Judea, Egypt, were hauled to Rome in chains. The men went to quarries, galleys, or gladiator schools. The women were often sent straight to brothels. To their owners, they were living investments, bodies to be sold for coin again and again. Some women were born free, but poverty closed in like a tightening noose. The city was expensive, food costly, and work for women scarce. Selling sex could mean the difference between eating and starving. It was not a dream, it was a grim calculation of survival. There were also those who entered the trade because of betrayal. A husband might abandon a wife with no dowry returned, leaving her with nothing but debts. An employer might promise steady work but instead forced her into prostitution. Rome's laws gave little protection to women without powerful family connections. A smaller, more dangerous path into the profession was coercion through kidnapping. Criminal gangs snatched young women from the countryside, smuggled them into the city, and sold them quietly to pimps. Without family or proof of origin, these women disappeared into the streets forever. Some were war trophies. When Roman legions returned from campaigns, they often brought prisoners, not just to parade in triumph, but to sell. A girl from a distant land, speaking a language no one in Rome understood, could find herself naked on an auction block the same week her village had burned. Occasionally, there were women who chose the trade willingly, not out of passion, but as a calculated gamble. A few ambitious freedwomen sought wealthy patrons, aiming to rise to the ranks of courtesans who lived in fine villas and dined with senators. But these stories were rare, and the path was perilous. Rome also had male prostitutes, though their stories were whispered even more quietly. Some were enslaved boys sold for pleasure, others free men who catered to wealthy women or male clients. Their lives were governed by the same mixture of survival, exploitation, and secrecy. Whatever their origin, the common thread was vulnerability. Whether captured, abandoned, impoverished, or deceived, the women and men who entered Rome's sex trade rarely did so with power in their hands. They arrived already carrying the weight of loss. This was the starting point for countless lives in Rome's hidden economy. Tomorrow they might be standing in the shadows of a tavern waiting for a stranger's coin. But tonight, in the quiet streets, they were just people who had been swept into the currents of the empire's most ancient trade. Not all prostitutes in Rome lived the same life. Some worked in filthy alleyways, their feet raw from standing all night, their eyes scanning for danger. Others reclined on cushions in perfumed villas, sipping wine as they entertained wealthy patrons. Between these two extremes stretched a spectrum of roles, each with its own risks and rewards. At the very top were the courtesans, educated, witty, and expensive. These women were more than lovers. They were companions, conversation partners, and sometimes even political allies to the men they served. Their clients could be senators, generals, or wealthy merchants. Courtesans could live in fine houses, wear silk and command high fees, but they walked a narrow path. One scandal could ruin them. Just below them were the lupanar as indoor workers, women who laboured in brothels. Their work was steady, but their world was small, often just a single stone room with a hard bed. They rarely saw daylight during working hours. Brothel prostitutes served a wide range of clients, from labourers to visiting merchants, and earned only a fraction of what the courtesans could demand. Then came the streetwalkers, the lupae, or she-wolves. They prowled the city's busiest districts, calling out from corners near taverns, bathhouses, and circuses. The streets were unpredictable. Some nights they earned enough to eat well, other nights they were robbed, beaten, or arrested. In the Subura district, a notorious working-class neighbourhood, there were tavern prostitutes, women who poured wine by day and sold themselves by night. Many were owned by the tavern keeper, who set their prices and took their earnings. The mingling of alcohol and sex made these places loud, dangerous, and unpredictable. Some prostitutes worked in public bathhouses. Officially, baths were for hygiene and socialising. In reality, certain sections became discreet meeting spots for paid encounters. Male and female workers both plied their trade there, mingling among the steam and marble pools. The fornicatrices took their name from the word fornix, meaning the arches beneath Rome's bridges. These women worked in the cold shadows under the arches, where travellers and cart drivers passed. Their customers were often the poorest men in the city, dock workers, slavers, and labourers who could pay only a few copper coins. There were also male sex workers with their own categories. Exoleti were older men who catered to both men and women. Pueri delicati were younger boys, often enslaved, whose beauty was exploited for wealthier clients. Their roles mirrored the hierarchy among female prostitutes, from luxury to street trade. And then there were the travelling prostitutes who followed Roman armies on campaign. Some were enslaved, part of the military supply chain. Others were free women chasing the coin of restless soldiers. Life on the road was harsher than the city. Tents instead of rooms, danger instead of law. From the silken courtesan to the archway she-wolf all lived under the same shadow, legal but dishonoured, wanted yet despised. The difference between luxury and destitution was not measured only in coin, but in luck, connections, and the whims of the men who paid. If you stepped into a Roman lupanar, you would smell it before you saw it. The air was thick with oil smoke, sweat, wine, and the faint bite of incense meant to mask the rest. A lupanar was more than a place of business. It was a machine of pleasure and profit built to keep its workers busy from dusk to dawn. The most famous brothel we know today stands in Pompeii, frozen in time by volcanic ash. There's 10 tiny rooms open onto a central corridor, each with a hard masonry bed. Above the doorways are faded frescoes showing erotic scenes, not for art's sake, but as a kind of visual menu for clients who might not speak Latin. Each room was barely larger than a closet. Privacy was scarce, the walls were thin, the noises constant. A woman could hear the next room's transaction as clearly as her own. The mattress might be a layer of straw, or cloth over stone, cleaned only when necessary. The corridor was the brothel's heart. Men came in from the street, sometimes in groups, laughing too loudly. A keeper, usually a leno or lenae, took their coin, guided them to a room, and made sure the schedule moved quickly. The longer a man lingered, the less money the brothel could make. Frescoes were more than decoration, they set the tone. Some showed acrobatic scenes of passion meant to excite, others depicted deities like Venus, giving the trade a thin veil of divine approval. For the women who worked here, these images were both constant and meaningless. They were part of the wallpaper of survival. Lighting came from oil lamps, their smoke staining the ceilings. The air was heavy and warm, especially in summer. In winter, the rooms were cold, the stones sucking away heat. Comfort was never the priority. The goal was speed, volume, and coin. Some brothels were large, with multiple floors and even private suites for wealthier clients. Others were just a backroom of a tavern, a curtain separating public drinking from private business. But the Pompeii model, a central hallway with tiny rooms, was the most common. The workers here rarely left during their shifts. Meals were brought in, bread, olives, watered wine. Sometimes a musician played in the corner to keep clients in a relaxed mood. Conversation was minimal, the transaction was quick, and then the next man would enter. The lupanar was both a prison and a stage. Within its walls, the workers learned to play their roles, seductive, submissive, or playful, depending on the client. Outside, they were invisible. Inside, they were the centerpiece of a business that treated their bodies as inventory. For the men who visited, the lupanar was entertainment. For the women who worked there, it was endurance. The walls absorbed their voices, their laughter, their cries, until all became part of the same muffled hum, a sound the city had long since learned to ignore. In ancient Rome, the line between prostitute and slave was often invisible, because for many women they were both at once. The brothel was not just a workplace, it was a place of captivity. A woman's body could be bought, sold and rented without her consent, and the law protected the owner's right to profit from her. The enslaved prostitute had no power over her work. Her earnings went to her owner, whether he was a private citizen, a tavern keeper, or a professional pimp. She could not refuse a client. She could not choose her hours. Her body was an investment, a commodity to be maintained and sold repeatedly. Some slaves were trained specifically for the sex trade. Their owners taught them to dance, sing, play instruments, or flirt in multiple languages. This training increased their value, especially for elite clients who wanted entertainment alongside intimacy. The leno, the Roman pimp, was often also a slave owner. He might own several women, moving them between taverns, brothels, or private houses, depending on where the most profit could be made. In legal terms, there was little difference between managing livestock and managing sex slaves. For enslaved prostitutes, pregnancy was complicated. Some owners saw it as an inconvenience that interrupted work. Others saw children as future property, new slaves who could be raised and sold. The decision was never the mother's to make. Not all slaves worked in formal brothels. Some were kept in private households to serve both as domestic labourers and sexual partners. This arrangement blurred the line between servant and concubine, but the lack of choice made it clear they were still slaves. The Roman legal system recognised the sexual use of slaves as the owner's right. The enslaved person's feelings, dignity or consent were irrelevant. It was considered part of property ownership, just as one might own a field or a mule. Occasionally a slave might be freed, either as a reward for loyalty or because she had earned enough to buy her freedom, but freedom did not erase the past. Many freed women remained in prostitution because they had no other way to survive. For most enslaved prostitutes, there was no escape. They lived and died in the trade, their names unrecorded, their stories untold. The empire's wealth was built not only on its armies and merchants, but on the silent labour of women whose bodies were part of Rome's economy. When we speak of prostitution in Rome, we must speak of slavery. The two were not just connected, they were intertwined, inseparable. To understand one is to understand the other, for in the empire's vast machinery, both were simply another way to turn human life into profit. In ancient Rome, prostitution existed in a strange space between acceptance and disgrace. It was legal, it was taxed, it was regulated, and yet it carried the mark of infamia, a permanent stain on reputation that no law could erase. A prostitute could work openly under the protection of the state, but she could never reclaim her honour. From the reign of Augustus onward, prostitutes, whether free or enslaved, were required to register with the city's aedile, the official responsible for markets and public morality. Registration meant giving your name, address, and sometimes even a physical description. Once registered, the label could not be removed even if you left the trade. Registration brought certain protections. A registered prostitute could not be prosecuted for adultery, since her work was not considered a breach of marital fidelity. It was a trade, but those protections came with heavy costs. She lost the right to marry a freeborn Roman citizen, and her word held no weight in court. The law treated prostitutes as infames, along with actors, gladiators, and executioners. This meant they were excluded from holding public office, inheriting certain forms of property, or wearing symbols of respectability. It was a social exile written into the law. Brothel owners, too, were marked by infamia. Running a lupanar was legal, but it was considered dishonourable. Owners paid taxes on the work of their prostitutes, sometimes a fixed annual fee, other times a percentage of earnings. The Roman state profited from the trade it claimed to look down upon. Not all sex workers registered. Some preferred to operate illegally, avoiding the registry to protect their identities. But unregistered prostitutes risked fines, harassment by officials, or being forced into registration if caught. There were also specific laws about where prostitutes could operate. Certain districts, like the Subura, became known for the trade. In more respectable neighbourhoods, prostitutes risked being driven out by residents or fined for public nuisance. The law did not protect a prostitute from violence as it did a respectable Roman matron. If a client refused to pay, assaulted her, or caused injury, she had little legal recourse. In the eyes of the courts, her dishonour diminished the seriousness of the crime. Still, the legal framework made prostitution an official part of Roman life. The state regulated it, taxed it, and benefited from it. It was a trade tolerated not out of morality, but out of practicality. Rome knew it could not exist without it. The paradox was complete. The law acknowledged prostitutes, protected their right to work and took their money, while forever branding them as unworthy of respect. In Rome, legality was not the same as dignity. In Rome, registration was more than a formality. It was a mark that clung to you for life. Once your name appeared in the aedil's record books, it could never be erased. Even if you left the trade, even if you married or moved away, the ink stayed, a silent reminder to anyone who checked. For some, registration was a bitter necessity. It made their work legal, reducing the risk of arrest or fines. It also provided a degree of protection from accusations of adultery, a charge that could ruin a woman's life. The state acknowledged her trade, and in return she paid her taxes. But the cost was steep. The status of infamia followed the registered prostitute everywhere. It meant she could never testify in court, marry a senator or a freeborn citizen, or hold certain kinds of property. It was a lifetime brand of dishonour. Some women refused to register, choosing to work illegally in the hope of avoiding the stain. They used false names, changed locations often, and relied on trusted networks of clients to stay hidden. But unregistered work carried risks. If caught, an aedile could force them onto the rolls against their will. Operating without registration also left a woman more vulnerable to exploitation. Without legal recognition, she had no recourse if a client refused to pay, or if a pimp cheated her. The law, indifferent to her plight, saw her as invisible. Some worked both sides of the law. A woman might keep her registered name for public work in brothels, while also using an unregistered alias for higher-paying private clients. It was a dangerous balancing act, profitable but risky if exposed. The registry itself was a tool of control. The aediles maintained lists of names, addresses, and sometimes physical descriptions. These records allowed officials to track movements, collect taxes, and enforce restrictions. A woman's identity became part of the empire's bureaucracy. Being on the list could also make a woman a target for harassment. Neighbours, knowing her status, might avoid her or mock her openly. Landlords charged higher rents. Shopkeepers sometimes refused service. In Rome, shame was a public currency. For those who managed to avoid the list, there was a fragile kind of freedom. They could vanish into the crowd, blend with the city's other poor, and keep their past in the shadows. But it was a freedom that could be shattered with a single mistake, a wrong client, a jealous rival, or the attention of the wrong official. The choice between registration and secrecy was no real choice at all. It was a decision between being shackled by the law or stalked by it. Either way, the system ensured that a prostitute in Rome could never truly escape the gaze of the empire. In the bustling streets of Rome, a prostitute could not always be spotted at a glance, but the trained eye could read the signs. Some signals were subtle, others bold, and a few were even enforced by law. Clothing, hair, and posture became silent advertisements in a city where words were not always needed. One of the most distinctive markers was the wearing of the toga. Not the elegant draped garment of senators, but a rougher, shorter version. Respectable Roman women wore the stola, a long, modest dress. The toga, in contrast, was associated with men and with prostitutes, a public signal that the wearer was outside the bounds of traditional womanhood. Hair colour was another clue. Some women dyed their hair blonde or red using wigs made from the hair of Germanic captives. Blonde hair was exotic in Rome, a visual lure that marked the wearer as available, or at least willing to be noticed. Jewellery could be both an ornament and an invitation. Large hoop earrings, jangling bracelets, and bold necklaces were more than decoration. They drew the eye and caught the light in dim taverns or crowded streets. In a world without neon signs, sparkle was a form of advertisement. Perfume, too, was a signal. Strong scents of cinnamon, myrrh, or saffron would cling to a woman's clothing, marking her even before she stepped into view. To some, it was alluring. To others, it was a telltale sign of immorality. Some signals were more physical than material. A certain confidence in movement, the way a woman met the gaze of passing men, the places she lingered, all became part of her unspoken advertisement. In Rome, a glance could be as deliberate as a spoken offer. Certain neighbourhoods acted as signals in themselves. Standing in the Subura district or near the arches by the Circus Maximus marked a woman as part of the trade, even if she wore modest clothing. Location was often the loudest announcement. Occasionally the signals were mandated. Some brothel workers were required by their owners to dress in ways that made them unmistakable. Bright sashes, revealing tunics, or gaudy makeup. The intent was to draw customers quickly in a competitive marketplace. For the women themselves, these outward signs were a double-edged sword. They brought attention, and with it income, but also danger. A bold appearance could invite wealthy clients, but it could just as easily draw hecklers, thieves, or worse. In a city where status could be read from a distance, a prostitute's clothing and style became both her armour and her vulnerability. Each choice, hair, dress, scent, was a calculated risk in the silent conversation between seller and buyer. Morning in Rome began with noise. Even before the sun cleared the rooftops, the streets filled with the clatter of carts, the calls of street vendors, and the chanting of water sellers. For a prostitute, this was not the start of the workday, but the end of a restless night. Many worked late, sometimes until the first light, and slept through the busy morning hours. If she worked in a brothel, her first task upon waking might be to wash herself as best she could. Water was drawn from a shared basin, and scented oil rubbed on the skin masked the scent of smoke and wine. In private rooms, she might light an oil lamp or crack open a shutter to let in a little light. Breakfast was simple: bread, maybe olives, sometimes watered wine to take the edge off a lingering headache. Food was fuel, nothing more. There was no leisurely dining. The day's first clients could arrive before noon, especially for those working in taverns or bathhouses. In the quieter hours before business picked up, some women tended to their appearance, arranging their hair, adjusting clothing, and applying a bit of kohl around the eyes. For those who could afford it, perfume was dabbed on wrists and neck, a small luxury in a hard life. By midday, the streets grew hotter and busier. If she worked outdoors, this was a prime time to catch the attention of passing merchants, travellers, or soldiers on leave. Streetwalkers positioned themselves near markets, fountains, and the entrances to bathhouses, places where men naturally lingered. In a brothel, midday might mean a steady stream of short visits, clients stopping in on their way to or from the baths. The keeper managed the schedule, making sure no room stayed empty for long. Privacy was minimal, business brisk. Evening brought the busiest hours. Taverns filled with drinkers, laughter spilled into the streets, and the warm glow of lamps lit the city's most dangerous corners. For many prostitutes, this was when they earned most of their coin, working deep into the night, fueled by the restless energy of Rome after dark. But with the crowds came danger. Drunken men could be unpredictable. Thieves prowled the same streets, looking for easy prey. A good night's earnings could be stolen in an instant if she wasn't careful. By the time the last client left, exhaustion settled in like a heavy blanket. Whether she slept in a brothel room, a rented bed, or a corner of a tavern, rest was never deep. There was always noise, always footsteps outside the door, always the possibility of being woken for more work. This cycle, wash, eat, prepare, work, endure, rest, repeated itself day after day. The rhythm was unchanging, but it kept her alive. In Rome, survival itself was a kind of victory, and for a prostitute, every new sunrise was proof she had managed it once more. In a city without newspapers, billboards, or glowing signs, advertising was a living, breathing act. For the prostitutes of Rome, finding clients meant turning themselves into moving advertisements through appearance, presence, and carefully chosen locations. Some relied on the oldest form of advertising, word of mouth. Satisfied customers became repeat clients, and their recommendations carried weight among soldiers, merchants, and travellers. A discreet network of loyal patrons was worth more than standing on any street corner. Location was everything. Standing near the entrances of bathhouses, circuses, or theatres meant being in the path of men with leisure time and coins to spend. Some even waited outside the public latrines, where privacy could be negotiated in whispered offers. In certain districts like the Subura, the streets themselves became an advertisement. Simply being seen there after dark was enough to mark a woman as part of the trade. No words were necessary. Location spoke louder than language. Graffiti served as another tool. Crude drawings, suggestive phrases, and even price lists were scratched into tavern walls and brothel entrances. For the literate, these inscriptions were direct invitations. For the illiterate, the imagery was clear enough. Brothel keepers sometimes hired touts, men who stood outside and called to passers-by, promising beauty, skill, or low prices within. These barkers could be persuasive, but their loud calls also drew unwanted attention from moralizing officials. Some prostitutes worked more discreetly, sending small tokens to potential clients: scented cloth, a lock of hair, or a tiny carved charm. These gifts were as much an invitation as a promise meant to tempt without public exposure. Music and performance could draw a crowd. Some women sang in taverns, danced in marketplaces, or played the lyre in public squares. Their talents brought men closer, and once the music stopped, negotiations began. For the most ambitious, high-paying clients were courted not with public display, but with social manoeuvring, attending private dinners, slipping into elite gatherings, or catching the attention of a wealthy patron in the theatre's shaded boxes. In the end, the art of advertising in Rome was a balance between visibility and discretion. A woman had to be seen to earn, but too much attention could bring danger. Desire had to be sparked, but never so openly that it burned her life down. The streets of Rome never truly slept. By day they roared with commerce, by night they shifted into something else entirely. For the women who worked them, the city after dark was both opportunity and threat, a place where coins could be earned quickly, but where a wrong glance could invite disaster. Street walking meant mobility. Unlike the brothel worker tied to a room, the street prostitute could choose her ground. She lingered near bathhouses, taverns, theatres, and markets. But this freedom came at the cost of safety. There were no walls to protect her from an angry client or a roaming gang. The Subura district was the heart of the trade. Its maze of alleys and densely packed housing made it a place where anything could be bought, if you knew where to look. Here, women called out to passers-by from doorways, sometimes with playful banter, other times with blunt offers. The arches beneath Rome's bridges were another haunt. The word fornix, arch, gave rise to the term fornication. Under these cold, damp spans, women waited for cart drivers, dock workers, and soldiers returning from the night watch. Street work demanded constant vigilance. A client could be drunk, violent, or dishonest. Fights broke out over payment, insults, or jealousy. The city watch rarely intervened unless property was damaged. Human injury was considered a private matter. Thieves knew the trade well. They watched from shadows, waiting for the moment when a woman left with a man, then followed to rob them both. Some prostitutes worked with guards or allies, men who hovered nearby for protection, taking a cut of the night's earnings. The weather could be as punishing as the people. In summer, the stone streets radiated heat late into the night, making tempers short and tempers dangerous. In winter, cold rain turned alleys into rivers of mud, and night without customers meant going home both wet and hungry. Noise was constant. Shouts from taverns, the clink of amphorae, the laughter of drunken men, and the occasional cry of pain from somewhere deeper in the alleys. For the street prostitute, this soundscape was the rhythm of survival. Yet for all its risks, street work had its rewards. A lucky night could mean several times the earnings of a brothel shift, and the freedom to choose clients, at least in theory. But luck was a fickle companion in Rome, and the next night might bring nothing at all. Every night on the streets was a gamble. The coins earned bought bread, wine, and a little more time in the city's relentless game of survival. The dangers never left, but neither did the hope that tomorrow might be just a little easier. Not every prostitute in Rome worked the streets or the crowded lupanar. Some conducted their business in quiet, well-kept rooms, spaces meant to give an air of privacy and comfort, where a client could imagine himself far from the noise and chaos of the city. These women catered to a different sort of customer, and their nights followed different rules. Private rooms could be found in many places: the back of a tavern, an upstairs apartment, or even a rented corner in a wealthy patron's villa. For some women, these rooms were theirs alone. For others, they were provided and controlled by a brothel keeper or a patron. The women who worked in such settings often cultivated a more refined image. Clean clothing, careful grooming, and polite conversation were part of the service. Clients paying for privacy expected not just physical pleasure, but the illusion of intimacy. Repeat customers were common. A merchant might visit the same woman every time he returned from a journey, or a young noble might quietly support a favoured courtesan for months. These arrangements could blur the line between professional and personal, sometimes leading to lasting attachments and complications. Privacy came with its own dangers. In the streets or the brothel there were witnesses. In a closed room a client could turn violent without fear of interruption. For this reason many women had signals, knocks, bells, or trusted friends nearby, to summon help if needed. Working with private clients often meant better pay. Instead of a few copper coins, a night might bring in silver denarii, enough to live comfortably for days. Some women used this income to save for freedom, buy property, or support family members. But wealthier clients could also be more demanding. They might expect a woman to be available at short notice to attend dinners or public events, or to entertain them for entire days. The work extended beyond the bedroom, requiring skill in music, conversation, and even politics. Some private workers became concubinae, long-term companions who lived with their patrons. These women enjoyed stability and protection, but they remained outside the legal status of wife, and their future was always uncertain if the patron lost interest or died. In the eyes of Roman society, the private worker's status was still the same. Infamia marked her, just as it did the streetwalker. But behind closed doors, away from the jeers of the crowd, there was space for dignity, and sometimes even tenderness. For some, private rooms were a refuge, a way to survive in the trade while avoiding its most dangerous edges. For others, they were just another gilded cage. In Rome, comfort and captivity could look almost the same. In ancient Rome, the figures known as leno, male, and lenae, female, were more than just intermediaries between prostitutes and clients. They were power brokers in the hidden economy of desire. They controlled the rooms, the schedules, the prices, and most importantly, the women and men whose labour made them rich. A leno could own the prostitutes outright as slaves, renting their bodies to clients for a fixed fee. In other cases, he acted as a manager, taking a percentage of a free woman's earnings in exchange for providing a workspace, introductions to clients, or protection from the dangers of the street. Female pimps, the lenae, were less common but not unknown. Some were retired prostitutes who had saved enough to buy or manage others. They often used their knowledge of the trade to train new workers, teaching them how to attract clients, handle negotiations, and keep themselves safe, or at least profitable. Contracts between pimps and free prostitutes were often informal, sealed by verbal agreement rather than law. This made them ripe for abuse. A leno could raise his cut without warning, withhold payment, or force a woman to take clients she didn't want. Some pimps specialised in high-end arrangements, acting almost like agents for elite courtesans. They could arrange private dinners, secure introductions to senators or generals, and negotiate large sums for exclusive access. These deals could make both pimp and prostitute wealthy, if trust held. Others operated at the lowest levels, managing a group of streetwalkers who worked dangerous corners. Their role was less about negotiation and more about muscle, making sure other gangs stayed away and that clients didn't walk off without paying. Protection often came at a price beyond money. Pimps could demand personal favours, force women to work longer hours, or threaten violence if rules were broken. In the harshest cases, the lenae was not a protector but a jailer. The law viewed pimps with suspicion, but their trade was still legal. They too bore the mark of infamia, excluded from holding office or gaining certain honours. But many accepted this willingly, so long as the coins kept flowing. In satire and comedy, pimps were often depicted as greedy, manipulative and cowardly, villains whose greed outweighed their loyalty. But the reality was more complicated. Some lenones kept their workers safe and made them wealthy. Others destroyed them. In the end, the pimp was a gatekeeper to survival for many prostitutes. To work without one meant greater freedom, but also greater risk. To work with one meant stability, but at a cost. In Rome, every choice in the trade came with its own chains. In Rome, sex was not just a personal transaction, it was an industry. Like grain or wine, it had its markets, its middlemen, and its taxes. For prostitutes, the most pressing question was simple. How much could they earn, and how much of it could they keep? Prices varied wildly. A streetwalker in the Subura might charge only a few copper asses for a quick encounter, barely enough for a loaf of bread, while an elite courtesan could command entire gold aurei for an evening's company. The gap between the lowest and highest earners was vast. In brothels, prices were often fixed by the keeper. Clients paid in advance, handing their coins to the leno or lena, who took their cut before passing the rest to the worker. In many cases, the prostitutes were only a fraction of what the client paid. For slaves, the situation was harsher. They kept none of their earnings, every coin went to their owner. At best, a generous master might allow them to keep small tips, which could be saved toward buying freedom, though few ever reached that goal. Free prostitutes working alone had the most control over their fees. They could negotiate directly, adjust prices for certain clients, and keep every coin, though they also bore all the costs, from room rental to clothing to bribes for officials. Some high-class courtesans earned enough to live luxuriously. They dined on fine food, wore imported silk and kept servants. But wealth in the trade was unstable. One scandal, one shift in fashion, or one vindictive client could ruin everything. The state took its share as well. Registered prostitutes paid taxes, either as a flat annual fee or as a portion of their earnings. This made prostitution one of the few trades where moralists could condemn you while still profiting from your work. Money also flowed sideways in the form of bribes, to guards who looked the other way, to tavern keepers for perks to work, or to pimps for introductions to valuable clients. Every coin earned passed through many hands before it could be spent. Some women managed their money carefully, saving to buy property or invest in small businesses. Others lived night to night, spending everything as soon as it was earned. For many, poverty was not the result of waste but of exploitation, their earnings drained by those above them. The economics of prostitution in Rome were a mirror of the empire itself. Vast wealth at the top, daily survival at the bottom, and an entire web of middlemen ensuring that the labourers, whether in fields, markets or bedrooms, rarely kept the fruits of their work. For the prostitutes of ancient Rome, the line between work and emotion was thin, shifting, and often dangerous. Their trade depended on offering intimacy, but rarely could they afford to feel it. Every smile, every laugh, every touch had to be weighed against survival. Love was not forbidden, but it was risky. Some workers built emotional walls so high that nothing could climb them. Clients became shadows, encounters became routine, and the only real connections were with fellow workers, women who understood the unspoken exhaustion in a glance. Trust was rare, but solidarity was real. Others found themselves caught off guard by affection. A kind word from a regular client, a gentle touch after a long night. It could stir feelings that complicated the transaction. Sometimes, these moments turned into affairs lasting weeks or months with blurred boundaries and whispered promises. In rare cases, love became escape. A wealthy patron might take a woman as his concubine, freeing her from the brothel or the street. But such arrangements were fragile. If his fortunes fell, or if he grew bored, she could find herself back where she began, only older and with fewer options. Many learned to play the role of lover without ever feeling it. They became actresses, masters of performance, tailoring every word and gesture to match what a client wanted to believe. It was not deception, it was survival in a city where honesty could cost you everything. For some, the only safe place to be themselves was after the lamps were out, when they were alone with their thoughts. In those quiet hours they could remember who they had been before the trade, or imagine who they might be if they could ever leave it behind. A few women found true friendship in the trade, sisters not by blood but by survival. They shared meals, hid each other's coins, warned each other about dangerous clients. In a city where everyone wanted something from them, these bonds were rare treasures. The hardest part was keeping emotion out of the work while still making clients believe it was there. Too cold, and they would go elsewhere. Too warm, and the boundaries would blur. The balance was delicate, and failure could mean lost income, or heartbreak. Male prostitutes faced the same tightrope walk. Whether serving men or women, they had to project desire while keeping their hearts guarded. In Rome, passion could be bought, but trust had to be hidden away. Sometimes feelings slipped through despite all precautions. A laugh came too easily, a kiss lingered too long. These small betrayals of the heart could make the work dangerous, not because love itself was dangerous, but because it disrupted the rules of the game. To survive emotionally, many prostitutes divided themselves in two. There was the public self, the flirt, the seductress, the companion for hire. And there was the private self, hidden deep, shared only with those they trusted completely, if at all. This ability to separate love from labour became their armour. Without it, the endless tide of strangers could erode them completely. With it, they could endure, even in the face of insult, violence and the crushing weight of infamia. And yet, despite all the caution, the trade could not erase their humanity. They still laughed at silly jokes, still grieved losses, still dreamed of better lives. Behind every transaction was a person who had lived, loved and lost before the coin ever touched her palm. When we think of them now, it is easy to see only the role. The prostitute in the brothel, the courtesan at the banquet, the streetwalker in the shadow of the arches. But they were more than that. They were mothers, daughters, friends, survivors. The empire may have defined them by their work, but their lives contained much more. The story of prostitution in ancient Rome is not just a story about sex. It is about power, survival, and the small acts of resilience that kept people going in a world that wanted to forget them. In the end, love and labour were never truly separate for those in the trade. Both were tools, both were risks, and both were ways of staying alive. Their voices may be faint now, carried only in scraps of history and the whispers of old stone walls, but they remain, and in that quiet echo we can still hear them.